Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Dialogue Box, where we dissent creatively. In today's episode, we meet with Rabbi Lee Weissman, a prominent Jewish interfaith activist based in California. Rabbi Lee Weissman has been an educator for past 25 years, teaching teens and adults about the Jewish faith. For the last 10 years, he has been actively building bridges between the Jewish and Muslim communities in the United States. His Twitter timeline is full of quotations from the Muslim saints and scholars. Lee did his PhD in South Asian Studies from Tamil Nadu, the southern state of India. And during his stay in Tamil Nadu, he would visit the neighboring state, Kerala. Lee encourages positive relationship between the Muslims and Jewish community and try to find similarities between these two great monotheistic faiths. So let's hear it from Lee Weissman about his love for Islamic spirituality and his activism for building peace and tolerance among communities. Welcome, Rabbi Lee Weissman. Today we would like to discuss about spiritual and the historical relationship between two great, wonderful faiths in the world, that is Judaism and Islam. Of course, we know the three great Abrahamic faiths in the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These have a lot of commonalities in terms of history and creed as well. For example, in the Holy Quran, we find Prophet Moses as the most mentioned prophet with so much repeated historic instances. We find in the life of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he had very close interaction with the Jewish community at Medina. In fact, on the day of his death, he had pledged his armor with a Jewish neighbor. So we find that there is an organic relationship between these two great faiths in the world.
I'll begin by saying that I know that you're from Kerala. And actually, part of my interest in this really was spurred by my trip to Kerala many years ago. I used to spend some time in the Jewish community in Cochin, and I was there for a Jewish holiday. And I was sitting in the home of the Koder Halegwa family, which is really the last big family of Jews that lived in Cochin. And as I was sitting there on our holiday, sweets were coming to the door. And people who were bringing the sweets were Christians, Hindus, Muslims. And it was the first time that I had really seen the possibility of communities living together, not only in peace and tolerance, certainly we have that in the United States, but in appreciation. There was something, it was not just, hey, I know it's your holiday. It was more like, you know what, we're celebrating with you. You're part of our community, and this was something that people did for each other, and I was so impressed with it. And at the same time, I remember going to the market in Matancheri, and I went to buy something, and the Muslim owner of the market said, "You don't want that." I guess I have, in the course of my life, and certainly have created situations in my life of very meaningful engagement between Muslims and Jews. We have a lot to talk about. As you said, we have, of course, a lot of religious stories in common to talk about. We have a lot of religious concepts in common to talk about. Probably most importantly, we have moral and ethical concepts that we share, and that I believe that the world needs to hear. And the less divided we are, the more that we can present those things to the world in a believable way. And honestly, when Jews and Muslims are fighting with each other, when we have our turf wars and really needless hostility over those, it delegitimizes our ability to communicate with the world ethically, because the world looks at us and says, "What do you people have to say? I mean, look how you deal with each other. Given how you deal with each other, what do you have to say?" So I really believe that we have a lot to say to each other, that can be meaningful, and that we can both be changed positively in that interaction.
We find, for example, after the conquest of Spain, the Christian conquest of Spain, the Jews of Spain, along with the Muslims, they chose the Muslim countries to live in. So we find there was a lot of interaction, cooperation, both economically and sometimes even politically. What do you think, in your opinion, are the areas where the Muslims and the Jews can find new areas of cooperation?
First of all, I mean, in terms of history, you're right that in Muslim countries, in general, Jews were afforded certain kinds of legal protections that they weren't necessarily offered in the Christian world. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't problems. Certainly, there were, and there was, different rulers and different polities had different policies on how they treated Jews, and of course, there's the issue of taxes and so on. And so it's a complicated relationship. Always was a complicated relationship. In our day today, there are different. I think there are a couple of different issues and areas where we have what to talk about. So one area that we have to talk about is, of course, in places like the United States, where we're both minorities, and to talk about what it means to be a religious minority in a place like this, and to have the kinds of values that we have in a place like this, and what we can contribute to a place like this. What does America have to learn from us? What do we have to learn from America? So I think that's one example. Another example, and I think this is now just beginning, is to explore what it means to be Jewish in the Muslim world. I mean, there are still a couple of Jewish communities in the Muslim world. Probably most vibrant is probably in Morocco. Small community in Turkey, and the second largest actually is in Iran.
Yeah.
And so the question is kind of what should that look like? We know now that in UAE there's a small but growing Jewish community. So what can that develop into? What kind of interaction how can that interaction be? Morocco is a great example because Morocco has kind of opened its doors to the Jews who are in its diaspora, the Jews who have moved to Israel and to other places, Israel and France and other places, and opened their doors and said, "Hey, we want you to come back, invest in us, visit us." And so when you go to Morocco, as there a couple of years ago, you see all sorts of Jews in Morocco coming for pilgrimage and coming, and coming to be part of that. And even the other day, I saw there was a service in Mexico City of expatriate, Moroccan Jews praying for the King of Morocco. How amazing is that? So that's the second, and the third, and the most difficult, obviously, is going to be to see what kind of engagement Jews and Muslims can have in the Holy Land, and that, of course, is the most difficult and the most problematic. But I believe that once we build relationships, meaning once we able to know each other and care about each other, then it becomes possible to discuss the things which are most important to us. Too often we try to discuss those things without having built relationships. I don't talk to strangers about the things which most matter to me, about my deepest secrets, about the things that I'm most afraid of. We don't talk about those things. So for us to talk about things which are really important and really sensitive, we have to begin by actually knowing each other and even more importantly, caring for each other. And deal making and negotiations without caring about each other are doomed. Because they will last only as long as it's in somebody's interest for them to last. Right? If we're operating on self-interest and if we're negotiating on self-interest and not on caring about the other party, there is no lasting peace or welfare between us. So I think those are the three areas that I see.
Thinking about the Muslim-Jewish relations, what comes to my mind is the situation before the 20th century and after. I think 20th century we has witnessed, a drastic increase in the spirit of nationalism in every community. So nationalism, I think, has really influenced the inter-community relations around the world. I think when we say nationalism, we have three areas, I think, which grew maybe simultaneously or maybe within a short while. We had the Zionist movement from Europe for a homeland for the Jews, which created a lot of ripples in the Muslim world. And also we had for example, the Hitler's the race idea of a Puritan Jewish German race idea, and he blamed the Jews for all the problems of Germany. So he gave a new version of nationalism. And also, I have to admit that there have been a nationalist movement in the Arab world, where the Islamic identity was replaced more by the Arab identity and Arab nationalism. So tell me, how detrimental, how dangerous is this nationalism to the cooperation and tolerance between the communities? Is nationalism actually hijacked our religious identity or religious sensibilities? What do you feel?
Yes, well, I am not an enthusiastic fan of nationalism on two grounds. One, as a religious person, and the second, as a former high school history teacher. If you're a high school history teacher and you teach, for example, European history, well, you can take a look and see kind of what the fruits of nationalism are. Unfortunately, the logic of nationalism is that whenever we create this in group, and we take that in group and we give it a kind of sacred aura around that in group, of course we're also creating an out group, and nationalism becomes a permission for oppression almost inevitably. In fact, maybe inevitably, right? If you once you put the crown right on the in group, you've now given yourself permission to oppress the out group. And I think that that's a pretty consistent logic of nationalism, and that's certainly true. Certainly true in all nationalisms. I don't think that any of them really are exceptions. Is it possible that a person could have nationalistic ideas and not subscribe to forms of oppression? And the answer is I think it's that people can. But at the same time, nationalism itself almost always creates these things. And as you said, of course, there are many nationalist movements. Zionism is one of them. Arabism is another one. And of course, in Europe, we have all sorts of varieties. Probably the most terrifying variety being National Socialism. National Socialism in Germany, the Nazi movement. I mean, but certainly this is, from the religious perspective, the danger, and I think you said it nicely, is that it replaces religion. I mean, it's the state or the people, the ethnicity, the language, all of these things replace our preoccupation with God and our preoccupation with the sacred, and essentially make us sacred. Right? Essentially kind of put the crown of divinity onto the head of society. And I think that of course is, very dangerous. And I think from a religious perspective, puts us in the neighborhood of idolatry, shirk, and I think that's a very dangerous place to be. It is a subtle kind of idolatry, but nevertheless, I feel like it kind of it leaks into that neighborhood, and that's a very dangerous place to be.
Well, I think you said it so beautifully. The crown of divinity. That's what I think every believer strives for, and I guess this is a very wonderful way of putting it. And when you say about idolatrous belief of nationalism, which is close to the idolatry, it reminds me of verse of Allama Iqbal, where he always mentions that nationalism is a curse for humanity. He was a universalist, and he always believed in the unity of humanity. You are a person who is extremely active in the Jewish community. Also, you help to build the bridges between the Muslims and the Jewish. Often in your timeline, your Twitter and other social media posts, you put a lot of emphasis on spirituality, and the the thrust of spirituality, I think, is to point inwardly, to put ourselves in the confession in the box, not blame the other. Significance of spirituality can never be overemphasized. In fact, without spirituality, we all know that religion does not exist. Do you feel that there have been deliberate attempts to hijack religion away from the spirituality? And I guess it's maybe influenced every community, including the Muslims.
For sure. I mean, I think we look in the world. We look in the world today, and we see so many movements who have kind of co-opted religion for political ends, for the ends of seeking power, and that's not new. I mean, I wouldn't say that's a modern disease. I would say that's a disease. That's a kind of one of the unfortunate corollaries of religion. If you have a political idea, how wonderful is it to get God on your side, right? Not only do I believe this is true, but God says it's true. Well, you can't get better than that. It's the best endorsement you can have. So certainly that's true in the world in the world today. And that outward looking, as you say, I mean, increasingly, we see people, who think that religion consists of pointing the finger at someone else, and that righteousness is kind of pointing out the faults of others. And to be honest with you, I feel like, and my experience is that when I do that, what I'm really doing is I'm projecting my faults onto others. Really, what I'm doing is when I'm pointing at other people. Usually, what I'm doing is I'm pointing to things which I'm trying to ignore in myself. And I think that if people spend more time in introspection, and I think that all political action should begin with introspection. If every political leader spent a little bit of time, right, with their own souls, I think they would come out with much different results, but they don't. And so, if we're going to create a politics, an ethical politics, is going to have to begin with some kind of spiritual accounting. To really kind of look at yourself deeply and to know what your prejudices are, to know what your weaknesses are, to know what your strengths are, right? All those things are not just good spirituality; they're also good psychology, and so I think we do see this kind of centrifugal force in the world today that kind of pulls us outward. And it's not just in politics; it's in everything. It's in entertainment. It's in all the things which distract us, and we live in a world of distractions. And so, what I try to emphasize, at least in a kind of a spiritual perspective, is to at least take a break from those things, right? From all the things that draw us outside, to take some time to be inside, and let that be the place where our action proceeds from, because that's our best place. That's the place where we are at our best. And if we can discover that, then we use that as the basis of action.
So you're suggesting, I think, a marriage of spirituality with all our domains of life, including politics, entertainment, education. Is that so? Are you proposing spirituality being intertwined in our daily life?
If it becomes more and more who we are and how we relate to the world, of course, it's going to be reflected. It's going to be reflected in our art, in our poetry, it's going to be reflected in everything, in everything that we do, and really, and most importantly, in our interactions with other people. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the most important thing that you do is the way that you interact with other people, is your ability to love and care for others. And if we begin with that and then extend those relationships outward, then we're really getting somewhere.
Rabbi Lee, I have often found in your Twitter timeline, especially, you often quote two great Muslim personalities who are Imam Shafi and Imam Ghazali. Now, these two personalities, of course, they are excellent contributors to the intellectual legacy of Islam. But apparently, they are from the two different streams. While Imam Shafi is from the jurisprudence or the fiqh, the law details, and he's one of the schools of the jurisprudence. While Imam Ghazali is to do with the mysticism about Sufism and the those seekers seekers basically. Tell me, how did you develop an interest in these two personalities, and what made you, stick to them? I mean, how you often you quote from those people?
A very interesting question. So maybe it's a little bit my Jewish background. Of course, part of the training, part of our kind of religious training and our study is to go very deeply into law. Okay, really, that's really, there's kind of the meat and potatoes of Jewish study is the study of religious law. And I love the study of religious law. One of the things that I guess I appreciate about Imam Shafi is that here is a person who's immersed in this world of logic and law, and then every once in a while he steps out, right, and he gives you the big picture. I mean, here's a person who was, for example, argued with many people, right? Argued his positions,
Right.
and then he steps back and he says about arguments, and this is what I quote very often. He says, you know what? He says, I don't argue with anybody if I don't expect to learn something from them. I don't argue with them. I don't argue with them without the expectation that maybe they're going to convince me. And to me, that is world changing. And for a person, and for a person who's doing law, it's even more world changing, because it's so easy to think that that world is black and white. It's so easy to think that a legal decision is black and white and nobody should argue with you. And he says, no. He says, I want to hear what's on their tongue. I want to hear what's going to convince me. So that's the first example. And the second example, and Ghazali, and I guess I'm also kind of mystically oriented. But what I very much appreciate about Imam Ghazali is that he, of course, is also a rationalist, in the sense that he presents mystical ideas, if you can call them that, ideas. And what I mean by mystical, I mean dealing with the interiority of religion. Right? Religion has an outside and an inside. Okay, so let's call mysticism the inside of religion. Right? So he deals with the inside of religion, just like Imam Shafi deals with the outside of religion. But he at the same time, he's able to present it in ways which are logical and rational. And so if you can combine the heart, the heart with the mind, that's step one and step two. Of course, step three is your heart, and then your mind, and then bring it all into action with your hands. But that's so I appreciate that very much. And one of the great Jewish scholars, who often, by the way, sounds very much like Imam Ghazali, sometimes very, very similar, is the Rambam, or Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Musa ibn Maimon. And he said we should accept truth from wherever we hear it. We should learn, and so if I find truth somewhere, I try to incorporate it and incorporate it and accept it and put it into action.
Weissman, you mentioned in your bio that you had spent some years in Tamil Nadu, where you had your PhD, and you occasionally used to visit Cochin. Now, Cochin has a very long legacy relationship with Judaism. We know there's a street called the Jew Street, and it is said that the Jews came in Cochin from the time of King Solomon. And of course later migration also. There is interesting fact that there is a version of Malayalam dialect called the Jewish Malayalam. I also read that Jewish Malayalam has certain words, loan words, which are very familiar with a very close to the Mapila Malayalam, which is the Muslim dialect of the Malayalam. Cochin is a very interesting melting pot of course, a lot of cultures. But I think in the entire state, there is a Jew street only in Cochin. So, can you share some of your experiences that you had while you were at Cochin and what you feel about Kerala? How Kerala sees maybe a different kind of ambience from the rest of the country in terms of communal harmony, education, cooperation, tolerance? Can you share some insight, please?
So first of all, I have to tell you, as a Jewish person, there's nothing more shocking than seeing a street called Jew Street. So I grew up in Philadelphia on a street that was known as Yew Road, Yew Road. It's the name of a tree, and our street was constantly being defaced by anti-Semites, and they would write Jew Road on it. And that was considered to be a horrible thing, and they'd paint swastikas and horrible things. So the idea of a place called Jew Street was bizarre to me, right? Such a strange thing. Okay, Jew Street, who would do that? But what I found was this very strange sense of welcoming. And I arrived on Jew Street, and all of a sudden it's like, you're Jewish, the synagogue's right there. It was just, it was a very strange experience. I had the opportunity to spend several Jewish holidays in Cochin, and I cannot tell you how beautiful it was. I mean, I'm very sorry that, when I was there, there was still a little bit more of a community, and the holidays were just beautiful. The synagogue was decorated with garlands of jasmine and silks on the walls, and the windows were open, and that beautiful fresh air was coming in. This little garden outside the synagogue, I mean, just absolutely just beautiful. And the traditions of Cochin, the traditions of Jewish Cochin are just really unparalleled in their beauty. Beautiful lamp outside the synagogue, and and the synagogue itself, and sort of the synagogue in Jewtown, is just beautiful. Um, a very spiritual, deep atmosphere, and the language. You mentioned Jewish Malayalam. So Jewish Malayalam, when it's sung, there's beautiful songs in Jewish Malayalam. Some of them about the Jewish king. There was a Jewish king in Kerala, Joseph Rabban. People don't know that there was a Jewish kingdom in South India. Like, who knew, right? In Kerala, there was actually a Jewish kingdom. And there's songs about Joseph Rabban, other songs. And the language is kind of an old Malayalam. It's very close to what in Tamil is called Mani Pravalam, which is kind of a mixture. It's Tamil with some Sanskrit, but of course with Hebrew words and Aramaic words from the Jewish context. But just an amazing culture. And people had handwritten books of these songs written out in Malayalam, and really something very, very special. So yes, there's a really unique Jewish culture in Cochin, which continues. Actually, there are Cochini synagogues in Israel now, and they continue the customs of Cochin, and it's really something very, very special. It was, and in general, I mean, Kerala in 30 years ago, was much more educated, I think, than almost any other place. Almost any other place in India that I visited. I mean, I think the literacy rate was off the charts compared to other states. I was, of course, younger then, but I was just like I am today. I love to have conversations. And one of the things I found in Kerala was this amazing ability to converse. That people that I met students and so on, and we talked about politics, we talked about religion, we talked about everything. It was kind of like a very lively student culture, a very lively intellectual culture. I guess that's the best way to put it. And as you said, I mean, that kind of coexistence. There was I've heard tell, I don't know whether it's true, I heard that in Mattancherry, where the synagogue is, that there was a weekly card game, and there were Muslims, Christians, and Muslim Christians and Jews, and there was one Jain guy, and apparently he was in charge of the food because he was the one person who was so vegetarian that everybody trusted him for the food. So he was in charge of bringing the snacks. You know, um, just that just does not happen in most places. And certainly what I saw in synagogue, I mean, it was amazing that outside the synagogue, on our holidays, there would be crowds of Christians, Hindus, and Muslims coming to greet us as we came out of the synagogue.
Okay.
Coming out of the synagogue, it's crazy. Like, it doesn't happen anyplace else in the world that I know of. You know, they're waiting outside, and it's wish us a happy holiday. It was crazy. But really, it was very nice.
The Jews community had infinite persecution facing in Europe under Hitler. The Holocaust is an unforgettable chapter in the misery of humanity. Coming to India, in the present scenario, the Muslims are almost in a similar situation. Not only in terms of the fascist forces who are lynching them, who are killing them, but also that people who do these things are kind of inspired by Hitler's race idea. I remember reading one of your tweets where you mentioned saying that I was privileged to be in India 30 years ago, a vibrant Muslim religious life informed by many cultural influences. I pray for the Muslims of India that they should be able to continue to enjoy the beauty of the traditions in safety, prosperity, and peace. Rabbi Lee, you're a person whose heart burns for the suffering of humanity. I've read that time and again from your tweets. Tell me, what do you feel about the situation of Muslims in India right now, who the international community has been expressing their solidarity and their sympathy for the community? But tell me, from the bottom of your heart, what do you feel for the situation that the community is in right now in India?
I'm not sure I have the words. I can't even imagine how scary it is. I can't imagine how terrifying it is. I mean, Muslims in India are as Indian as anybody else, and so fully partake in the culture. Um, it is terrifying that people could be so disenfranchised so quickly and based on such an ugly ideology. Um, the Hindu nationalist ideology has progressed so fast into these kinds of areas of racial kind of theories and all this stuff, and it's kind of headed that direction so fast that it's really mind-boggling. Nobody really could have been prepared for that, really. I mean, I remember seeing the beginnings of it already 30 years ago, and I never would have anticipated that it would get where it is today. And of course it's terrifying. And I really feel for my Muslim brothers and sisters in India, to feel so insecure and to feel so under threat, and to have it kind of, even worse, to have it kind of undergirded by this kind of Nazi-like ideology is really painful. And to see so many of the things which I so admired under attack. I saw recently that somebody had built a shrine to the murderer of Mahatma Gandhi. And like, I have trouble fathoming this. I just can't. My heart just can't accept it. I don't know what to say. I mean, here was one of the most brilliant ideas of nonviolence to appear in the world, and appeared in India, and in the form of a man who was had an incredible struggle with himself, and really is a model for all of us, and to dishonor his memory that way, and it just goes on and on. And so I really, I really feel for the Muslims in India, and I also feel for them that in that disenfranchised, feeling disenfranchised. I don't want the. It's not mine to say, but it would make me sad to see them kind of move away from that very tolerant Islam that you do see in India. I mean, what I saw was really acculturated Islam. I guess the Mappalays are probably a pretty good example, right? Mappalays are as essential to Kerala as any group could be essential to Kerala. It's just, when I think of Kerala, I think of Mappalays. It's part of it's so much part. There's so much part of the scene, and to feel disenfranchised from that and separated from that, and either socially or even religiously, would be really sad.
You mentioned about Mappalites. I remember once you quoting a line from the book Slogans of the Sage, which was attributed to Sayyid Muhammad Ali Shihab, a great Mappala leader. What did you feel about when you came to know about his personality a little more closer?
It's funny, I was just talking to somebody about that today, because I was talking about this interview with somebody, and I said that one of the things that impressed me about the book was that, I'm always looking for ethical leadership. I'm always looking for people, whose worldview is not just about the politics of power, but a politics of principle. And one of the things that impressed me is that there seemed to be a lot of principle in the way that he sort of saw his role as a politician and leader. Now, the world is really lacking in leadership at the moment, and what we have in the form of leadership is mostly power mongering, and I don't think the world can benefit from that. So certainly, it's a pleasure whenever I see somebody who's in a leadership role who also is operating on principle. I'm always impressed.
Interfaith activism is not a rosy life. It's not an easy walk. It takes guts and a lot of courage to love one another and to propagate to love one another. Hating is very easy. It's in fact an act of cowardice. So I'm sure you would have come across, there are so many people who appreciate your hard work and your love and tolerance, but I'm sure you might have met with a lot of opposition also, both from your own community and sometimes from the Muslim community who misunderstand your mission. Can you share what it is to be an interfaith activist?
So certainly there is opposition, and that does happen, and really from both sides. At the same time, I try to weigh the benefits against the losses. And whenever I do that, I see the benefits are much greater than the losses. I live in a much nicer world than almost anybody I know, because I live in a world of people who are friends, and if they're not my friends yet, they will be. And what I found is that it's really transforming from the inside out. You become a different person because you have a real appreciation for the value of humanity. We say, we have an expression in the Torah, which is a little controversial for Muslims, that man is in the image of God. Now, we don't mean that God has an image, that we look like God, nothing like that. God is not physical, nothing like that. But there's something about human beings which is that valuable, that really has that much dignity, that we should be able to see something divine in human beings. And I'll call that thing, let's call it a soul, right? And the soul that was breathed into Adam. And the more you attend to that, the more joy you get in being around people. So I feel very, very blessed. I feel very blessed. I feel very changed by it, and I feel very, very blessed. And the opposition, well, okay, we deal with that. It's life is struggle, and at least it's a struggle for the good.
We pray that more souls like you would remain in the world to help bridge our communities and to do away with the hate and all the extremism that is in the religionist people. And you succeed more in your mission to build more peace. And every believer should be a peacekeeper and a peacemaker as well.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Thank you.